everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of the Advanced Study. I'm joined today by Dr. Neil Graham, and he is a clinical lecturer in neurology, and he's also a part of the TBI study in Advance. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Graham.
Pleasure, yeah.
What is the Advance TBI study, and what is TBI?
So first of all, I think it's helpful to explain probably, what TBI and traumatic brain injury means. So people are probably familiar with the concept of head injury. So, people, if they fall or have a road traffic accident or involved in a blast explosion, might sustain a head injury. And traumatic brain injury refers to, what happens to the brain when there is a sort of physical injury to the substance of the brain. So that's what TBI refers to. So the Advanced TBI study is a really exciting new study that we're delighted to be able to set up and to get started on. The aim of the Advanced TBI study is to, first of all, understand the types, patterns of injury affecting the brain that members of the advanced study cohort have experienced during their sort of battlefield service over their careers, and particularly in relation to the sort of combat exposure in Afghanistan. As you know, the advanced study is a sort of cohort study with half of the group exposed to major battlefield trauma and half of the group unexposed. And so our aim is, first of all, to try and define what kind of injuries people have had. And then second of all, we want to look in great detail at the consequences of those injuries. So there's a range of problems that people can have related to a significant traumatic brain injury. And so we're going to be doing a number of tests to try and better understand the consequences of those exposures and what that means for people's brain health in the long term. So some of the tests we're going to be doing include MRI scanning of the brain. So this is whereby we use a powerful magnet to get a very detailed picture of the substance and structure of the brain. And we can look very sensitively for any trauma-related damage. So sometimes people see some scarring on the brain. Sometimes we see some abnormalities of the blood vessels related to trauma. And we're going to look very sensitively using a special technique called diffusion tensor imaging at the fine white matter connections within the brain, which can be particularly sensitive to traumatic injuries. So we're particularly interested at some of the blood markers that might relate to brain trauma. We've done a number of studies in the past looking at markers using a very sensitive blood test. So now it's possible to look for brain proteins. So these are chemicals within the brain that get released when there's damage into the blood. And with a very sensitive analyzer that looks for sort of 0.0000 to the 15 concentrations of brain chemicals in blood, we think that we might be able to quite sensitively detect if people have any evidence of sort of ongoing injury related to previous trauma. So by combining, the MRI scanning, the blood tests, we're going to have an idea of what's going on within the brain and how that relates to injury exposure. We're going to look at a genetic score that relates to people's risk of developing things like Alzheimer's disease and see how that relates to long-term outcomes after injury. And I think importantly, we're going to do some memory testing on people who sign up to the Advanced TBI study. And that will give us an idea of how people are functioning now. And the idea is that we bring people back over time and see, if there's any change in their performance. And I think this gives us a really useful way to be able to try and relate the initial injury and the extent of that injury to the consequences that we can see now in terms of tests like, the brain scanning and the blood tests. These are called biomarkers, and also kind of function in terms of what people can and can't do and their performance on memory testing.
So can things like the biomarkers in the blood, could they also link into kind of other injuries sustained or other areas of the body that could affect as well as the brain?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So, the answer is one of the reasons for doing the work is that we don't yet have a completely comprehensive understanding of, why some people do really well after a head injury and why some people do really badly. And more generally, thinking about kind of brain health, we know that certain environmental risk factors are important. We know that people's genes are important, but also various environmental things like, how much exercise you take, your sort of metabolic cardiovascular health and so on. So there are a number of things that also might relate as well as head injury. And the advanced study is a great opportunity because it's already very detailed testing about other parts of the body to look at how different things might sort of overlap and relate to long-term brain health. So I think cardiovascular status is a really important and relevant factor that we'll be able to kind of specifically account for in this cohort. I think, thinking about kind of systemic mechanisms linking things, there's obviously a concern about the role of inflammation when people have had a sort of major traumatic injury, and whether that might, contribute to or worsen or propagate problems in the long term. So I think, our plan is to work very closely with other investigators in advance to try and unpick some of these different contributions to kind of long-term brain health, thinking about kind of injury, but also cardiovascular status, systemic inflammation, and a range of other measures.
Mm-hmm. With things like kind of a stressful lifestyle or mental health, would they also kind of affect like the brain health? Will those also be looked at, or is that kind of a separate?
No, I think that's related. So, Advance already looks at a number of kind of mental health outcomes over time, and kind of, repeatedly test people for kind of symptoms relating to head injury, but also mood symptoms, depressive symptoms, anxiety, PTSD symptoms. And these can obviously be kind of exacerbated by, traumatic brain injury. One of the concerns more broadly has been in the head injury field about, whether there's some sort of relationship between repeated head injuries and long-term problems with brain health like dementia. And that's certainly something that's been kind of voiced when we've spoken to participants in the study when we were sort of setting this up. And I think, one of the challenges is that although that sort of link exists to some degree, it's not clear how strong that is or who might have problems. And it's clearly not the case that absolutely everyone who has a head injury of any kind develops, a problem like dementia. And so I think a really important part of this is going to be about, following people up over time, seeing how things are, seeing how they kind of relate to the total amount or sort of dose of injury if people have had repeated injuries over time. And trying to take some of that kind of learning and hopefully, inform kind of future safety measures, public health measures, preventative measures as they sort of apply to sort of currently serving men and women in the armed forces.
What is interesting or different about the cohort, these group of people? Is it just because the advanced study is taking place and it's a good opportunity, or is there something particular about former serving and serving personnel?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a really special cohort. I think it's an absolute unique kind of cohort, and it's a fantastic opportunity to be able to do the advanced TBI study in this group. I mean, some of the really kind of unique things about this are, so the cohort's already been established. So, it takes a huge amount of kind of time, investment, on the part of sort of research funders, but also for participants to engage in a study like this. And so, a cohort of 1,145 people has already been kind of assessed in very great detail. Blood tests have already been done at the baseline visit for all of the cohort. And kind of follow-ups at around the 3-year point have been done in around 600, 650 of those people. So there's been a huge investment already in this particular group. And I think the additional benefit from some of the sort of TBI, the brain health investigations, is like sort of multiplier effect in terms of that existing investment. To set it up from scratch would be pretty full on. And I think the other thing to say is, it's obviously a real world kind of cohort of people. We know that there's been some exposure to very significant battlefield trauma in half the cohort. That's the way it's set up. And I think so the exposures are there probably. We suspect a substantial proportion of the cohort will have had some sort of traumatic brain injury. I suspect being a serviceman probably comes with having some exposure to mild injuries throughout the course of a career. Just as being a sort of sportsman or woman comes with having some mild TBI exposure. And I think so that there's obviously the injury for the purpose of the study, which is the sort of the injury that required medical evacuation from Afghanistan, which is how the cohort's set up. So you got half who had that and half who didn't. But I think one of the interesting things about this cohort is obviously there'll be people who've had mild TBIs in the past in the sort of control group.
Yeah.
And there should be a spread of those injuries in terms of like sort of the severity or quantity, the sort of total dose of injury over someone's career. That's going to vary a lot throughout the cohort. And I think having that exposure and a variability in that exposure is going to be very powerful when it comes to, relating that to some of the imaging measures, which will, therefore vary over a large range, the blood measures, the cognitive tests. And that's going to, I think, make it easier to make sense of what this data means. And I think, it's a representative cohort of certainly of the experience of our armed forces in the Afghanistan campaign. I think, what we learn from this will hopefully be therefore very relevant and applicable to servicemen and women in future campaigns. So I think it has a very clear path to kind of real world impact, what we learn from this.
Personally, for you, is there a specific area that interests you the most? Is there something that really kind of gets you excited and fizzing over what the results could be or could show?
Yeah, I mean, so my specific interest is in kind of understanding about dementia after traumatic brain injury, and this is obviously something that's received quite a lot of media attention over recent years. So my PhD was funded by Alzheimer's Research UK to try and sort of disentangle some of the mechanisms and work out why some people get this and why others wouldn't. And I think that this study is kind of beautifully set up in terms of being a cohort that will be assessed over time to try and to shed some light on some of these questions, actually, because, given the amount of kind of media attention and concern, what's remarkable is that there is relatively little kind of hard, longitudinal, over time data of people's experiences.
I guess dementia is quite new in terms of research.
I mean, it's historically been really underfunded, and I think having some kind of really well-designed, rigorous research in a group of people who, some of whom have been exposed to traumatic brain injury and following people over time, is really powerful. And, some of the tests that we're doing, things like the blood tests, the brain scans, we'll be able to look at those over time. And in people with, for example, Alzheimer's disease, changes can sometimes be seen in some of these tests well in advance of people developing symptoms. So, I think, my expectation is, and my hope is that that our participants will go on to have good brain health, and and I hope that people don't go on to develop problems. But I think to some degree this is it's a scientific question, and I think it needs to be answered. And I think the people in the study will probably want to have some sort of awareness of their own brain health. They're doing these sort of memory tests and things, and I think that more generally, if you're participating in an activity, you join the military or you become a rugby player, it's useful to know what the risks are in terms of long-term brain health, and those risks may be overstated or they may be understated, but what we really need is good scientific evidence. So yeah, I'm really excited about getting some objective kind of evidence, from the study to try and, remove some of the confusion. I suspect remove some of the anxiety, because I think there is a lot of anxiety about dementia and head injuries. And I think, information is always better than not knowing. And I suspect it may be that we find that the total amount of head injuries that you really need to have problems downstream may be relatively high.
Can you highlight a few or explain a few of the tests that the participants will actually go through? I know you said
of course,
MRI scans, but what else? What else will they?
So let me give you an example of one of the tests that that I think is a really fantastic innovation that we're going to be using in the cohort. So there's a blood test analyzer machine called the Simoa, which is sort of called a single molecule array, and it looks for very, very tiny concentrations of brain chemicals in the blood. And in the past, you'd have had to do like a lumbar puncture test, so to test the spinal fluid to know what's going on in the brain. But since the advent of these kind of new ultra sensitive tests, it means that we can just take a sort of normal blood tube, collected peripherally, like any other blood test, and look in great detail at that to find out what's going on kind of right now in the brain. So one of these tests is called the neurofilament test. Neurofilament light is the name of the chemical, and this is one of the scaffolding proteins. So the long parts of the nerve cells called the axons have these kind of skeletons within them that give it some structure, and that's built of things like neurofilaments. And when there's damage, such as people having a head injury acutely, at the time of injury, you can take these tests and you see big rises in these chemicals. And in people who've got, ongoing injury or damage to the brain or degeneration, you also see, elevated levels of these chemicals in the blood using this technique. And one of the interesting things we found in some of our traumatic brain injury work in the past, for example, where we followed people up for a year post-injury, is that you still see elevations in this neurofilament light test in blood, this marker of brain degeneration. Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting finding. And it suggests that there's some ongoing, tail to this brain injury that lasts over time. Yeah. One of the kind of central questions here is about, whether these kind of degenerative changes that are seen after injury are, the direct consequence of the injury and things just gradually dying back over time after one injury, or whether these represent, a degenerative process that's being kind of triggered and grumbling on, and, like a sort of rolling snowball that's going to cause kind of potentially more and more problems. And I think these are just, scientific questions that haven't yet been answered. And having things like the blood neurofilament test over time in the advanced cohort is going to provide really, really useful information about that sort of thing. The other thing that you can do to look for neurodegeneration, so brain volume loss over time, is to look at the brain scan. So, with the MRI, you get a beautiful, high detail, high resolution structural picture of the brain. And if you scan somebody once and then you repeat the scan several years later, as we plan to do within the advanced TBI study, you can align that person's scans, and you can use a kind of computer program to look very sensitively for, which parts of the brain are shrinking, if any, and, to what extent are they shrinking. So, you can look at an individual level to see the kind of long-term consequences of injury, and it provides pretty objective, reliable data, really.
That's so interesting. I didn't actually realize that you could compare a brain scan, like one on top of the other, and actually see areas that like are shrinking or have changed dramatically.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's been done in things like Alzheimer's disease for a number of years, where you take a pair of scans, you align them, sort of electronically, and you can see which areas are changing or having volume loss. And in the traumatic brain injury world, we've done a number of imaging studies over the years where we looked at people in the chronic phase after injury, and shown that there is this sort of abnormal rate of brain volume loss, sort of brain shrinkage over time in some areas, particularly the white matter. And this seems to be quite a distinctive thing with traumatic brain injury. But, the question is, is this a process that's getting worse over time or kind of resolving? What does that really mean in the long term? If people, for example, people don't have memory problems yet, does that mean they're going to get, or they would never have them? And so these are kind of questions that need to be answered, really. And I think, the advanced TBI cohort and the study is really a great way to do that.
I guess it's going to give a good foundation of data that you could potentially look at in the future, in 50 to 100 years. You could probably actually look at how to kind of reverse those effects if you can get actual answers to things, and that this certain injury is going to cause, or is more likely to cause, this type of pattern going forward. I guess you can then research how you can actually stop that dead or reverse it.
So I agree. I think there are two really important points, actually, the sort of so what of this kind of work. So number one is like prevention. So if you understand what happens, with a particular dose of injury, is there a certain amount of force on the brain that the brain puts up with and tolerates? And is there a threshold above which, people are going to get problems? What sort of people, who've already had exposures need to have monitoring over time, once we know what these thresholds are? And what can we do today for people serving to protect their brain health? So number one is prevention. But I think number two is a really important point is, given that traumatic brain injury is kind of recognized as a risk factor for dementia, as we increasingly understand the mechanisms of how that works, then you obviously have a group of people who have a known exposure where you can kind of monitor things, and you could intervene and give a treatment, and you could see if that stops, for example, brain shrinkage over time, or normalizes levels of this nerve filament protein in blood. So I think it lends itself really well, actually, to kind of treatment trials. For people who have an acute injury, obviously you know when it's happened, and you've got a window potentially early after that when you could give a treatment that might be particularly efficacious at stopping, the generation of dementia downstream. one of the problems with the Alzheimer's field, has often been this suggestion that, drug treatments are being tried too late after the damage has been done.
Yeah.
And the sort of analogy with TBI is, you could obviously give this really quickly after injury, if you had evidence that it would work. And in terms of the scanning and the blood test, this would be a framework by which you could, get evidence about whether a treatment's working, without having to wait for 20 or 30 years for people to develop progressive symptoms, because there's often a lag between brain changes and people having symptoms of things. So I think we have to, in terms of, what's in it for the individual, at the top level is that they're kind of contributing to science and to protecting kind of, people in future. I think at the individual level, there are some other possible benefits, I suppose. So, people will get their brain scan reports, that's sort of shared with them. Generally, the rule is that if you know what it means, then it's a reasonable thing to share with somebody. In terms of some of the sort of research aspects of this, there are lots of tests that we'll be doing that yet we don't really know what they mean in any one individual. And the point of the science is to try and answer some of those questions. So so for example, people have the right to know how they perform on some of their memory tests, for example. And at the individual level, that might be interesting for people to know. I think there are some things that will be of interest to people who are within the study that hopefully will be useful for them. But I think that sort of the bottom line is, a lot of this is stuff that we're doing because we need to kind of try and get some scientific answers to sort of potential problems. And I think that's a really exciting thing. And there's a great deal of enthusiasm. I mean, the cohort are incredibly publicly spirited and altruistic. And, I'm extremely grateful to the participants for the kind of fantastic commitment they've made to the study and for their enthusiasm. So I should say that advanced TBI is a sort of sub-study of the main advanced cohort. So, we'll be inviting all of the participants in advance to take part if they want to. So it's an optional study, and it involves, a few extra tests, when you come for your assessments at Stanford Hall. So the MRI scan, where you sort of lie down and have a brain scan, so that takes, about an hour at most. And then we do some memory testing, which takes sort of about an hour to an hour and 10. So it's relatively unobtrusive, and we do everything we can to try and make it a sort of comfortable and interesting experience. So, we hope that people will be interested in taking part, and we're really excited to be able to offer it. And I'd also like to thank, the Advanced Charity and the Headley Court Charity, particularly for supporting and funding the work, because I think it's really important work. And I think this is a great way to kind of, get useful answers to these really important research questions.